very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. We've got a very experienced and knowledgeable panel, I'm pleased to say. And we have got, as our first and main speaker, Kat Smith, who is the Shadow Secretary of State for Young People and Democracy, representing the Labour Party, who has been key to the debates in the committee stage of this bill. And I'm very pleased that she can join us. She might have preferred, perhaps on the first day of recess, to spend time at home, but has instead joined us. So we're very grateful to her for that. We're also joined by Kunleon Lude, who is MBE, Director of Voice for Change England, who I think will focus on the impact on BME communities, perhaps of voter ID and perhaps other aspects relevant to BME communities. We have got Matteo Bergamini, the CEO of Shout Out UK, who will focus on the impact on young people, something which I know his organisation and indeed others such as My Life, My Say are really exercised about. Then I will say a few words about the Electoral Commission and the government plans for the Electoral Commission before handing over to Jess Garland for her to focus on perhaps the surprise addition to the bill, which emerged with no notice in relation to changes to the voting system for mayoral elections and police and crime commissioners and some other aspects, and indeed perhaps some positive aspects about the way the bill has been opened up in a way that this has enabled other amendments, positive amendments, to be tabled, which might not have been possible otherwise. So what I'm hoping we'll be able to do is leave at least 25 minutes for questions at the end. So I'm going to be quite ruthless, I'm afraid, with our panel, and we'll give them their marching orders if they stray far too beyond the time that's allotted to them. And that includes me. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Kat to brief us on the bill, but also the committee stage and what has been achieved in the debates at committee. Kat, over to you.
So much, Tom. So in terms of where we left off, I suppose the bill had its second reading on the floor of the House of Commons, and there was MPs speaking in opposition to many different aspects of the elections bill. And then the bill, once it's finished second reading, it's passed second reading, as all Conservative MPs piled through the lobbies, votes for it. So it went into committee, and the first 2 days of committee was hearing evidence from different expert witnesses, which was going quite well. We were getting quite a lot of quotes from different witnesses who either academics or experts who work in the elections field, telling us things that were very helpful for as evidence of our points that, you know, voter ID is not necessary, it will lead to people being disenfranchised, and things were going quite well. Not quite well, because obviously the bill's dreadful, but as well as can be expected in receiving evidence as a committee, when suddenly an instruction motion got laid on the floor of the House, which means, and I had to be told what this was because this hasn't happened to me before, this is quite an unusual parliamentary manoeuvre, which then extends the scope of a bill after it's already started, and I think that you don't need a very deep understanding of fairness and democracy to know that if you change the parameters of a bill after it's already had its second reading and it's already in committee and it's already taking evidence, you are not going to get the level of scrutiny of the things that you add into a bill that you would normally expect to get. And the thing that got added in was the changing of the electoral systems for mayoral elections in England and police and crime commissioner elections in England and Wales, to change it from a single transferable vote to a first past the post electoral system. And I made a point of order in committee as soon as we realised what was happening, and asked whether or not we could ask the witnesses about, for example, electoral systems and merits of maybe first past the post over an STV electoral system. And we were told by the chair we were not allowed to ask witnesses for evidence on this, because at that point the instruction motion hadn't passed. So as a committee, we were then banned from actually quizzing our witnesses about some of the contents of the bill that we have before us now. I have never known anything like that happen. It feels deeply undemocratic, it feels deeply unfair, and it feels like a government that is trying to dodge scrutiny. So then, of course, we finished taking evidence and we moved to what we call line-by-line scrutiny of the bill. So we literally go through the bill line by line, and we debate any amendments that people have tabled to insert things into the bill or perhaps remove things from the bill. And So when we moved into that stage, there was sudden a change of personnel. So the Conservative minister who had been taking the bill on second reading and the first 2 days in evidence sessions was Chloe Smith, who was the then Constitution Minister. Of course, we had a government reshuffle in the middle of a bill, which meant that on the first day of line by line, we had a brand new minister. So Kenny Badenoch is the new minister. We had a new government whip on the committee, and somebody else changed, the PPS changed. So we had 3 new members of the bill committee who had not heard any of the evidence from the witnesses in the earlier sessions. I think that most people would say that that does not seem like 3 MPs that are able to scrutinise this bill to the extent that they should be able to. And I'd say that was a problem in itself. But the bill also changed departments at that point. So it went from being a Cabinet Office bill to Michael Gove's new department of levelling up and communities and housing, I think. I've got those in the wrong order, but yeah, whatever that new department's called. It basically then changed things like, you know, there was some new civil service staff in the room, and it was possibly the most chaotic, disjointed passage of a bill through committee that I have ever experienced. And the new minister, Kenny Badenoch, obviously brand new to this area, policy area, she's never really looked at it before. And on a human level, you know, I kind of almost feel quite bad for her that she has just been put before a committee with myself, who I've done the front bench role for democracy and elections for the Labour Party now for 5 years. So and she'd done it for 5 minutes. So I was trying to be as gentle as I could. But the truth of the matter is that when I challenged her on various aspects of the bill, when I challenged her about the contents of, say, the Russia report and the impact on opening up overseas electors and what that meant in terms of foreign donations in British politics and potential malign government influences from overseas, she literally said in committee, "I've not read the Russia report." And there's not really much you can say as an opposition MP once your government minister admits to not reading a significant report which has huge implications on the bill that you're meant to be scrutinising. I don't know if anyone was following closely, but the opposition parties were supporting, it had been tabled by Patrick Brady, the SNP MP for Glasgow North, and he tabled an amendment which was supported by the RNIB to strengthen the protections for blind and partially sighted voters, which, you know, the Labour Party was supporting, the 2 SNP members of the committee were supporting. We spoke to it, we made the case for it, and the argument basically is that at the moment every local authority, every returning officer has to provide a tactile voting device to voters. The current bill before us takes away that sort of baseline protection and says that, you know, the returning officers can use whatever technology they fancy, which creates a postcode lottery, doesn't create any kind of minimum standards. So we're challenging that. When the minister was asked to respond to the amendment that we were putting forward, backed by the RNIB, the chair said, "Would the minister like to respond?" And she said, "No, not really." And it's very difficult the bill committees work when there's a two-way conversation. And certainly for the last day in committee, I don't think any Tory MP spoke for any length of time whatsoever. And it felt like they either didn't want to defend or they couldn't defend some of the contents of the bill. So very briefly, those are the kind of like jaw-dropping highlights of the bill committee, which was mainly surprised that the government minister was so unprepared for it. But those of you that don't know, the bill obviously contains the requirement to show photo ID to vote in UK parliamentary elections and PCC elections in England and Wales, as well as local elections in England. Now, that's probably had most of the headlines, and obviously requiring people to show ID, as I think we'll probably end up discussing, excludes some voters more than others. We have put amendments in to try and expand that list of different ID documents. We put down an amendment to try and allow attestations, so which is used in some US states which do have voter ID laws, that if you didn't have ID or you weren't able to find your ID, that you could bring another voter and they could attest that yes, you are who you say you are, yes, you are Tom Brake, and you are an elector here and you can vote in this election. So we were trying to find sort of these compromise positions, but certainly on all our amendments on voter ID, we were defeated resoundingly in every vote. The changes to overseas electors abolishes the current 15-year limit, so it will allow all British expats to vote in UK general elections, regardless of how long they've been outside the UK, or even if they've not previously been on the electoral register. At the moment, they have to have previously been on the electoral register. So potentially, if you've left the UK as a 2-year-old and you've lived overseas for 60 years, then you become an elector. Now, this is the sort of sneaky bit, which is it's not really about votes. This is about donations, because when somebody becomes an elector, they also become a permissible donor. And so it opens up the possibility for many new political donors to be coming into the UK political system and be able to donate to political parties. And I don't think it takes a genius to work out what might be going on there. The section 25 of the bill around joint campaigning, it brings in new measures on political parties campaigning jointly with what we call non-party campaigners. That is disproportionately going to have an impact on the Labour Party because of our relationship with the trade unions. It also makes it more difficult for parties to work together, so the possibilities of what we might call progressive alliances, that also makes that more difficult. One of the most sinister parts of this bill, in fact, actually, I think the most sinister part of the bill, which I don't think has enough coverage in the press, is the changes to the Electoral Commission. And I'm not going to steal your thunder, Tom, and say too much on this, but if the government get to set the agenda for the Electoral Commission by writing their strategy and policy statement, it is a politicisation of our watchdog. And we're seeing this across the board, and it's not just in this space of democracy and elections, it's also, if we look at the political control over things like the BBC, if you put together that pattern of behaviour, you can see a very clear pattern arising where this is a government that does not like scrutiny, it does not like to be held to account, and it likes to, you know, when it breaks the rules, frankly, it likes to change the rules, which I think we saw very clearly in the House of Commons last week with the Owen Paterson case and the vote there, where one of Boris's mates gets in trouble and suddenly we want to change the entire scrutiny system. So it fits in with the sort of ideology that we've seen ploughing on really in the last wee while down here in Westminster. There are some changes around disability, and the government would say they're approving accessibility to support a wider range of people to assist disabled voters in a companion role, stuff like that. That's fine, obviously, but when they're removing the protection for blind and partially sighted voters to have an understandable baseline of what they can expect, it makes it incredibly difficult, and it basically creates a postcode lottery for blind and partially sighted voters. Interestingly, many disability charities have also, despite this bill on the face of it looking like it's an improvement for disabled voters, have raised the concerns that people with disabilities are less likely to have the required ID to show to be able to vote in the first place. So there's a kind of mixed bag for sort of the disability community on that one. There are changes to lots of other things, and what was really striking was that there was some changes, and we'd got one win on committee, which I don't think I've ever managed to persuade the government of anything on committee before, but Cammy Badenoch, who's the new minister, is quite techie and forward thinking in that regard, and one thing I've been ploughing away for years, which is really not that important in the grand scheme of things, but would be an improvement, is the ability to register for a postal vote electronically. And she did say to the committee that that is something she wants to go away and pursue and put down as a government amendment. So we may have made some headway in that you may be able to get a postal vote online in the same way you can register to vote online. But I'm afraid that's possibly the only sort of win. It's a very weak win that we've got on committee. But normally, to be honest, as an opposition, we don't win anything in committee, and normally the government vote down absolutely every opposition amendment regardless. And they pretty much admit that's what they were doing anyway. So I suspect that the progress on this is going to happen in the House of Lords, which is someone who believes in democracy and our politicians being elected and accountable. It's deeply upsetting that we are trying to defend our democracy by relying on an unelected House of Lords. The irony is not lost on me, but I'm afraid that's kind of the sorry state of affairs that we've ended up in. And it probably raises many more questions than it answers as to how we've ended up in that position. And I believe, Tom, I was meant to speak till 20 past, but I've actually managed to think I finished 2 minutes early.
You have indeed. Thank you very much, Kat, and thank you for some fantastic insights into what's been happening on the bill. And I must say that we and other organisations have had very extensive support from the Labour Party and indeed the SNP for the amendments that we have wanted to see tabled at committee stage. And you referred to the impact on people with disabilities. In fact, the government's own impact assessment of this bill says that people with the most severe disabilities are the ones who are going to be most affected, because they have the least access to photographic voter ID and will undoubtedly find it the most difficult to obtain it. So it will have the negative consequences, I'm sure, that you've set out. I'm now going to ask Kunle to speak, and Kunle, as I said, is the Director of Voice for Change, which represents BME organisations in the charity and not-for-profit sector. So Kunle, would you like to speak on this issue for us?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I must admit, prior to the bill actually being formulated, Voice for Change England, my charity, has always taken an interest in the registration of voters and the move to get more people to participate in the civil society as it exists. And to that extent, we worked quite closely with government through the May years and even more recently in pursuing that objective. So the actual emergence of this bill, and particularly the parts that relate to voter ID, are something of a contradiction in relation to the work that we've been doing with government over a number of years. And I know that Matteo's here from Shout Out Loud, and also others, My Life, My Say, were also involved in those discussions going back several years. So it's an odd place that we now find ourselves in, that we have a government which is now putting down, as we see it, barriers that will inevitably make it more difficult for people from certainly Black and minority ethnic communities to participate in voting. And I think it's a strange kind of twist that has taken place, which to a certain extent makes no sense in terms of the priorities that we want to push, certainly as a civil society organization. But just to make the general points, the bill itself has been likened almost to an attempt to protect the governing class from democracy, rather than an extension of it. Our interest, as I say, is in the specific element relating to voters' ID, and it goes back a number of years. But in terms of just looking at the pilots that were tried out over several years, it's self-evident that it does have an impact on voter turnout. We've also followed some of the commentary coming out of the United States in terms of policy measures that have been attempted there. And in general, what we found is that studies indicated that ID laws have reduced turnout by about 2 to 3%, which can translate into tens of thousands of votes being lost in a single state. In terms of obtaining ID, also costs voters money. Even if it's offered for free, voters still have to incur numerous costs relating to things like birth certificates and applying for government issued ID. And then you have the three main civil rights organizations in the United States, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the campaign Common Cause, who said that while they did not campaign directly in the UK, it was a common principle that such voter ID laws without evidence of widespread election fraud are harmful in terms of impact. So, I mean, what does that then translate in the kind of reality of things? Well, as I'm sure many people are aware, it's been estimated that something like 7.5% of the electorate would be affected who do not have access to any form of voter ID. Primarily by that, I'm talking about passports and driver's licenses. Indeed, the actual take-up of driver's licenses has in recent years gone down. In terms of the data that I've seen, members of marginalized groups are much less likely to have that kind of ID. And these include women, those living in urban areas, people under the age of 20 and over 65, much less likely to hold a driving license. And as I said, the possession of driving licenses has dropped by something like 40% in the under 20s, making it a very poor basis for voter ID policy. A more recent survey by the Department of Transport found that only 52% of the Black population hold a driving license compared to 76% of white populace. And similarly, the data all indicates that any attempt to put in place any kind of ID scheme will have negative results. My final point I would just make in terms of introductory parts is really about the example of Tower Hamlets, which gets wheeled out time and time again in defense of this stuff. And even though there was clear evidence of postal voter fraud in particular, it has to be said that the sparse number of cases, even there, would not have been enough to determine the outcome of the final election. We're talking about less than 100 votes. So I'm not here to defend a legal act, far from it. I think that people who engage in these activities should definitely be brought to book. But the point is to be able to look at something which is so minuscule, so minor, and try to extrapolate from that a whole new set of domestic policies in relation to voting rights is absolutely wrong. And I think that ultimately, the point has been made time and time again that in respect of personalization, this country has an excellent record in relation to fair and free voting experiences. So the question still arises, if that is the case and that is the general trend, why is the government still wanting to push this aspect of the bill and the bill in general, which, as I said, my kind of general take on it seems to be an attempt to actually protect those who rule from those who actually want to extend the democratic franchise. And, I'll leave
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kunle, and thank you for referring to Tower Hamlets, which, as you say, is rolled out by the government as the justification for what they're doing, albeit, of course, as you highlighted, most of the fraud that happened in Tower Hamlets was actually around postal votes. So it has no impact or relevance to photographic voter ID, which is the thing that they're pushing really heavily as part of this bill, at a cost potentially of £180 million over 10 years, as their impact assessment highlights. Matteo, would you like to talk a bit about the impact on young people?
Sure, no, definitely. Thank you, Tom. And I think, yeah, just to echo what Kunle said earlier about that sort of one example that consistently gets rolled out. It almost, saying this is using a sledgehammer to crack a walnut is probably even an understatement at this point, because again, if there was widespread evidence of electoral fraud, and there was widespread evidence that there was fraud of this nature, then we'd be obviously having a very different conversation. But the evidence base just is not there. To say a little bit about us and kind of the effect on young people, We at Shout Out UK run political and media literacy programs in secondary schools and colleges. And just to give a very, very brief kind of take, political literacy is the kind of bare bone basics understanding of how our democratic system works, so understanding, you know, how to register to vote, what does an MP do, how to get elected, first past the post, all the kind of the bare bone basics that frankly should already be in schools, but for one reason or another isn't. As well as media literacy, which is how to critically analyze the information we receive online, papers, TVs, and so forth. And we also run bespoke programs. We ran London Voter Registration Week last year and this year. Last year, we managed to increase the voter registration of young people across the capital by 23%. In comparison to the week prior. We're still waiting on the feedback and the data for this year's run, but we managed to engage with just over 4 million people across the capital again. I think it comes to no surprise to anyone here that young people are going to be less likely already than the majority of the population to register to vote, as well as, of course, vote. And the Electoral Commission released some research that suggests that they are going to be less likely to be aware of the proposed changes to ID, also to the requirement of having ID for future elections. Also, one thing to bear in mind is that the proposed list of acceptable forms of ID are often formats that favor older voters than young people. So, for example, ID issued by schools, colleges, universities, and so forth will not be accepted as far as I'm aware. And one of the things that we often forget about, and you know, offering free ID is one thing, but first of all, people need to know that these opportunities or these options exist, which at the moment they don't. And there is absolutely no clarity as to how the government's going to be relaying any of this information to not just young people, to anybody. But more so than that, there is a problem at the moment where we're living in a pandemic of misinformation. Sorry to use that word, but I think the gravity of the situation needs to be spelled out. At the moment, we're living in a time where misinformation is rife. Their trust in government is at an all-time low. We work with a lot of PRUs, so people referral units, where some of the most underprivileged, some of the most marginalized young people go, and they will not be registering for free ID from the government because, frankly, they don't trust the government. So there is this gigantic breakdown in trust, which isn't our job as educators to build. What our job is to help them understand how the system works, for them to make change for the better. So there is a massive breakdown on trust, and putting an additional barrier to getting involved in our democracy is going to do nothing else but hamper their involvement in it. One thing to bear in mind, and again, moving forward, because I think we all need to be aware that obviously this bill is going to pass, these barriers are going to be put in place, and how can we mitigate and make sure that young people don't get pushed out of voting altogether, especially those most marginalized from society. And one of the things that we're going to be doing with Unlock Democracy is creating a series of resources, both animations and infographics, to make sure that young people are aware of these changes and how they can still remain a part of the electorate and a part of the voting process. We also run the APPG on political literacy, which Kat Smith is, of course, a vice chair for. And we're going to be pushing to make sure that political literacy is a part of every school's syllabus. Because we recently released a report with James Weinberg from the University of Sheffield, which looked at parental and teacher attitudes. And one of the things that we found was that both parents and teachers believe that it's a necessity to teach politics in schools. They support it. They believe that people should know how their system works. But what we also found was that less than 1% of teachers have the necessary tools and skills to actually deliver this properly. And one of the biggest ways that we can counterbalance this restriction of how to involve ourselves in our democracy is through education. It's making sure that every single young person moving forward, when they become part of the electorate, knows how the system works, knows how to get involved, and knows all the different opportunities that there are available. Because if you don't know these opportunities exist in your world, they might as well not exist. So we're going to be campaigning and pushing for giving teachers the kind of tools through CPD and other training sessions to make sure that they are properly equipped to deliver political literacy, as well as campaigning with organizations like Unlock Democracy to make sure that there is awareness around this, around these new additional barriers. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Matteo. Again, very insightful. And you flagged up something which I think people should be aware of, is that there will be, I think, something of the order of 400 local authorities that are going to be responsible for issuing these free forms of ID. It is going to be very hard indeed for organisations like yours and like ours to explain to people what they have to do to secure it, given that the approach is likely to be slightly different in each and every one of those 400 authorities. It's a pity the government didn't consider, in fact, doing this centrally, as happened not initially, but later on in Northern Ireland, where they have already got photographic voter ID. I just wanted to say a few words about the Electoral Commission and concerns that Unlock Democracy and other organisations have there. Kat referred to it earlier. So the Electoral Commission is the independent body that oversees elections, and particularly election spending. And the Electoral Commission has, over the years, fined all of the political parties, Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats, possibly not the Greens, I don't know, maybe the Greens as well, but certainly the three parties I mentioned first, because they've broken the rules. Now, that is exactly the role of the Independent Electoral Commission, but the government proposals in relation to the Electoral Commission, so introducing a strategy and policy that will be defined by government, is something that is going to take away the independence of the Electoral Commission, because the Electoral Commission will have to follow the government strategy and will have to follow their policy. And if the government strategy is that, oh, well, if parties commit offences, we don't want you to prioritise taking them to court or investigating possible breaches, then the Electoral Commission is no longer an independent body. To make matters worse, the Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission currently will, or is about to have, I suspect, again, a majority of Conservative members of Parliament on it. So that means not only will the Electoral Commission have to implement a strategy and policy set by government, but also it's the way it has dealt with that strategy and policy is going to be reviewed by a body that will have a majority of Conservative MPs on it. The only reason that it hasn't currently, unless things have changed in the last few days, is because a Conservative minister, Luke Hall, stood down from that position, and it is due to be filled. We have written to the Speaker, along with a number of other organisations, saying, please, Mr. Speaker, at the point in the future when you are the person choosing who to replace, he isn't the person who's going to choose who to replace Luke Hall with, but when in the future you are the person, because he does appoint members of Parliament to that committee, that he does not appoint another Conservative MP to ensure that that committee at least isn't dominated by the governing party. And this is the first time it's happened since the Speaker's Committee was set up. So we've raised those issues. We've had them taken on board, I'm pleased to say, by the Labour Party and the SNP. We have encouraged the government to take them on board and wrote a joint letter to Stephen Barclay setting out. I think at that point he was theoretically in charge. There was a period where, as Kat was saying, there's complete confusion as to who was responsible for elections. I think we also sent it to Michael Gove as well to belt and braces it. We're still waiting for a response, but what we don't want to see is an electoral commission that is dependent on government. In New Zealand, they have made it very clear that they do not want the strategy and policy set for their electoral commission because they think it should be independent. Well, I agree with them, and that's exactly what we should be doing in the UK. But unfortunately, that is not what this bill proposes. That's enough from me on the Electoral Commission. I'm now going to ask Jess to pick up on the changes that happened, which Kat was referring to in terms of that sort of surprise instruction and those new voting systems, or the very old voting system that was proposed for the mayoral and police and crime commissioner elections, and also a number of other issues in the bill. Jess, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. And I don't think we can really stress enough how important this bill is for democracy. I mean, it is so broad and yet very unbalanced in so many ways, and it really does come down to fairness. And I think given the sort of the things that have been put on the table with this bill, the actual process for bringing this bill in is a real cause for concern. And Kat touched on this. I mean, this bill has come in very quickly. It was announced in the Queen's speech in May, and then in July we had a draft of the bill containing all sorts of things, like on the Electoral Commission, which nobody had been warned about. It had no pre-legislative scrutiny, and then had reached its second reading by September. And PACAC, the committee that look at constitutional issues, were taking evidence on this bill as it was going into second reading for MPs, and it's just a sort of crazy situation. The bill also came out 2 days before the Committee on Standards in Public Life published a really important report on money in politics, which is backed up by a huge amount of evidence. Those recommendations, strange enough, did not come into this bill, even though they would have been in the scope, because the bill does touch on those issues. And then, of course, as Kat said, after the bill had been through second reading, the government put this new clause in, which is changing the electoral system for mayors and PCCs. And the government knew they wanted to do this. The Home Secretary announced it in March. So why it's come into the bill in the way that it did, I think raises a lot of questions. I mean, as Kat said, it did extend the scope of the bill, so that has enabled Kat and others to table some fantastic new clauses around vote 16 and automatic voter registration, and the sorts of democratic improvements that we would all want to see, and would do that wider thing of kind of improving people's engagement rather than kind of shutting people out. But those didn't pass, unless I missed something quite incredible. They didn't pass at committee. So, you know, we do have a bill that is being rushed through, and for me it feels like very much the start of a slippery slope. And Matteo and Kunle there outlined some of the things about voter ID which are a concern. And what worries me is, what does this policy look like down the road? And what do many of these policies look like down the road, maybe under, you know, different circumstances? You know, how long before the money runs out for those free elector cards, or councils can't keep their offices open? And it might seem a small detail, but those can actually be used to manipulate the situation. I mean, in the States, there's one area where the issuing office for the free elector card is only open on the 5th Wednesday of every month, and there's not a huge number of months that have a 5th Wednesday in them. So you can see how these mechanisms can be used to manipulate elections in the future. And I think Kunle was right there to draw the parallels with the United States, where these sorts of laws have been brought in to suppress votes, and they've been brought in on the back of unjustified claims of fraud. And we're seeing a real pattern of that here with the talking about Tower Hamlets and all the things people mentioned earlier. So one more thing I would just say is what really strikes me in that comparison with the States is that even in those states with the strictest ID laws, there is an opportunity for voters to cast a provisional vote and come back later and prove who they are. Or, you know, in the more relaxed states, sign an affidavit, have someone vouch for them, all these sorts of things. And again, Kat and her team tabled a number of amendments to try and bring in some of those measures, which again were rejected. And so we are heading towards, with the bill as it is drafted, a type of photographic voter ID which is stricter than even the strictest states in the US. And I think that should be a real sound some alarm bells. And I guess I would just finish by saying, I think some people might recall that this bill started off as an electoral integrity bill, and electoral integrity is multifaceted. It's not just about people proving who they are in order to vote. And I think there's lots in this bill which actually could undermine electoral integrity. And that for me is the overarching problem, that this bill is a very one-sided look at our electoral system. It's an unbalanced look. It's focused on who is voting, not getting more people voting. You know, it's focused on how much campaigners spend, not on who's funding political parties. And ultimately, I feel it's very much focused on narrowing politics rather than broadening it in the way that us and others in the democracy sector would really like to see. So and that is why I think, you know, we're all saying just pause and rethink this bill, and it really does need a big rethink.
Thank you very much, Jess, and thank you for keeping the time and possibly depressing us all further by saying that voter suppression in the UK is even tougher than in the US. So that'll be something to reflect on. What you also did was highlight rightly that initially this bill was called the Electoral Integrity Bill. and there was an opportunity to change our electoral system for the better, including doing some of the things that Kunle was referring to, for instance, in having and Matteo, having a real push on voter registration, for instance, making sure that the 9 million people who are not on the register currently, who could be, encouraging them to get on there so they can vote for whoever they want to vote for. But that, of course, was very much a missed opportunity. Now we've come to the end of the speakers' contributions, but please do go and vote in the Q&A, because we've got a number of questions there which I'm going to come to that are at the top of the list in terms of having the most people voting for them. So I'm not necessarily going to take all of Sarah Cowley's questions, because she's sort of dominating the questions, but we will cover as many as we can, and we're going to start with one of Sarah's, and that is really a question directed at Kat, and that is, what do you think about proportional representation?
I struggled to unmute that. As Kat, I'm publicly on the record as saying that proportional representation would be a better voting system. You know, I will defend the supplementary vote, not STV. I misspoke my contributions for mayoral elections and PCCs, but to be honest, I just do not think that the current electoral system we have works in the 21st century. It doesn't work in multi-party systems. So I represent a marginal seat. I won the seat that I represent, Lancaster Fleetwood, off the Tories in the 2015 general election, and that did involve people saying to me, I mean, I remember like a conversation I had, close your ears, Tom, but I spoke to a Liberal Democrat member in Lancaster who said to me, I'm a member of the Liberal Democrats, but I've done a vote swap online, and so I'm going to vote for you here, and this person who would normally vote Labour is going to vote for the Liberal Democrats in a seat that was tight between the Liberal Democrats and Tories. And I just don't think that is a good way of doing politics, and I think there are obvious better ways of doing politics. I personally recognise that a proportional voting system I think would better reflect the country's will, and that to me is unquestionably more democratic. Speaking as the Shadow Minister for Elections of the Labour Party, you know, the Labour Party is committed to you know, consulting on these matters, and it's not an open and shut case. And recently at our party conference, and I'm sure there's somebody who's on this webinar that's a Labour Party member who was one of the many people who, you know, actually worked really hard, and you know, I did what I could behind the scenes to try and pass that PR motion. We came very close, and I think it's probably a matter of time before official party policy changes. But I mean, I was publicly signed up as a supporter of PR before I got my front bench brief doing what I do. So yeah, I'm always on that sticky wicket of having to explain that yes, I am personally 100% committed to proportional voting. It's just not quite party policy yet, but we got within a few votes of getting it at our party conference in the autumn.
Thank you, Kat. I'm not going to ask anyone else to answer that question because it's very much directed at you. There was a follow-up which is relevant because you referred to it from Sarah, which was, does the elections bill affect tactical voting? My assumption is not, but maybe I've missed something, Kat, and maybe if any of the other panelists have a view on whether it affects tactical voting. Kat.
It's probably going to end up being a matter for the courts, I suspect, because there is part of this bill around joint campaigning and the implications that when it comes to third-party campaigners having to declare what each other are spending, it does make it more difficult, I suspect, for doing joint campaigning progressive alliances. However, I think it is going to be one of these things in the same way that the gagging bill, which is not called the gagging bill, but everyone knows it as that, you know, scares charities off being politically active. This bill does much the same. So if you don't know when the short campaign is, so basically you can't spend over a certain amount in the final 12 months before a general election, but you can't know when a general election is because the Fixed Term Parliament Act has been repealed, and therefore the only person who knows when spending kicks in is the Prime Minister. You can see the obvious unbalanced playing field in that sense. You know, and I literally stood up in committee and said to the Minister, I was like, really simple question. Are we currently in a regulated spend period? And she couldn't answer it because no one can answer it, because we don't know if by the 9th of November next year, we will have had a general election. And if we have a general election before the 9th of November next year, we are today in a regulated spend period. But at the moment, if you are a third-party campaigner, if you're a trade union, if you're a charity, if you're an NGO, like, you just do not know if your spending is currently being regulated or not. So you can breach a spend limit, not completely unwittingly. So it's just absolutely appalling.
Would any of the other panelists like to come in on that question? If not, I will go to the next question, which is from Vicky Seddon, and that is, do any of the panelists believe that the embarrassment of the government over the Paterson issue will make them any more amenable to sensible discussion and amendments to the elections bill? Would anyone like to pick up that question? I think the silence suggests that Kunle would like to come in.
Yeah, and it kind of touches on that last question as well. It's probably been forgotten in the midst of time that when the first lobby bill was produced, to our surprise in the charity sector, and certainly from the perspective of the trade unions, what was constructed to target professional lobbyists suddenly was applied to the charity sector and trade unionists. And we spent a very uneasy time trying to get from the government what they defined as lobbying activity on the part of charities and campaigners from community groups, and the relationship between that and at the time what was being said was anybody that's engaged in a government contract could no longer lobby or campaign and hold that contract at the same time. So the kind of crossover between this and the Act, I think what kind of concerns me is the fact that the government has so much on its plate, but it's still willing to pursue both initiatives, and in particular the question of changing the lobbying rules at the same time as trying to introduce new rules around the electoral system. I think they've bitten off more than they can chew. However, that doesn't mean they're not going to actually go forward and try and pursue both. I think it's madness, but there's something that's, as I've said at the beginning, very incoherent around the question of the electoral space and this government at the moment. It no longer seems to look at these questions logically. And so from the standpoint of a crossover between, for us, is the question again, our role as third sector bodies, can we campaign without being pulled up by government legislation? You know, the charity sector was designed and built to lobby, to campaign, to question government and hold it to account. This seems to be now a more problematic area.
Thank you, Kunle, for highlighting that. Does seem to be a rather strange sense of priorities that the government have pursuing this agenda at a time when there are so many other challenges. I don't know if none of the other panelists want to come in on this.
About the Erin Paterson situation and whether or not that embarrassment is going to make the government more amenable. I suspect that it won't make them more amenable because they're pretty stubborn. But I think it will have an impact because, of course, the bill's now finished in committee. So then next stage in the Commons will be report stage. Now the government decides when that happens. I think that they might have been minded to bring that reasonably quickly. I think that potentially, and I am just speculating, I have no inside knowledge here. I think that we might now be waiting a bit longer to get it in report stage, because what the government don't want is MPs on the floor of the House of Commons debating this bill, given the context of everything that's gone on, because so much of the sleaze that they are dealing with front page after front page on can be brought into the debate on this. So I suspect it might just mean the bill takes slightly longer to get through the Commons because the government decide the timetable of when things happen. So I think it might give us more time to debate it. But more importantly, if that delays it going into the Lords and delays it getting royal assent, it potentially means that the next May's mayoral elections, which are happening in some places, would still happen with the supplementary vote system and not first past the post. So it could actually have a real life impact, because at the minute we don't know if next May's mayoral elections, and I know Croydon's got some, but I think there are other places as well, they at the moment would happen under supplementary vote. If the bill's finished and got royal assent, it would happen under first past the post. So it might actually have a tangible impact on those set of elections.
Great, thank you for flagging up that the potential that this will push back the report stage of the bill. I suggest we go now to a question from Adrienne, which is, how can we achieve similar levels of democratic rights as in Scotland and Wales, where all residents can vote? And maybe there's a sort of campaigning angle to that, which I don't know whether Matteo or Jess would like to pick up. Because in Wales and Scotland, as I understand it, any resident can, irrespective of nationality, if they've lived in the UK or Scotland, Wales for a certain period of time, is it? I'm not sure, can vote in local elections, which is not something that applies in England. Would anyone like to come in on that? Matteo?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. How? I mean, there's got to be political will in Westminster. And when I say political will, I mean from the majority in the Commons and in the Lords. Also, to bear in mind that also in both Wales and Scotland, Wales more recently, they've now given the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds as well. So young people are very much a part of the conversation. The reality is that at the moment, we are kind of dealing with, especially primarily in England, where there isn't that political will from the ruling party to make elections and democracy more accessible. In fact, this bill suggests the opposite. And I think, I mean, I don't necessarily want to beat on this drum too much, but I think one of the biggest tools that we have in the kind of third sector and in the charity sector is education, and educating as many people as possible about their rights, about understanding what politicians are doing in their local area, to make sure that they can hold them to account. Because at the moment, we really have no other way to hold people to account aside from the ballot box. So making sure that people are aware of the changes that are happening, are aware of how they can engage with elections, and making sure that people know what MPs are voting on. So, for example, making sure that when someone goes to COP, for example, and starts talking about climate change, what is their actual voting record on climate change? Because at the moment, especially now where we're living at a time where misinformation is rife, it's not just misinformation coming from random people online that you kind of don't know where it's coming from. Sometimes that misinformation is coming from political parties. And that's a massive issue, because we're completely breaking down that trust, but also kind of creating this kind of mishmash of what is factually accurate and what is spin. And there is a massive issue there, because at the end of the day, if we don't know what is factually accurate and what isn't, you end up voting on emotional beliefs or things that don't quite make sense. So we need to make sure that people are aware of how to critically analyze, how to get engaged, so they can actually effectively hold people to account. And it's a massive uphill struggle. And in Scotland and Wales, there is support from both devolved governments to make that a reality and to make people feel more involved, which at the moment in England, there isn't in general.
Great.
Sorry, that was
Matteo.
fairly depressing.
Thank you, Matteo. Would anyone else like to come in on this question? No, in which case we will move on. I mean, obviously, as well as knowing how people have voted on issues, in relation to Geoffrey Cox, people would also like to know whether he'd actually been voting in this country or not, whether he was abroad when he was doing it, but that's a different issue. And we now have a question from Catherine Bearder, which I think initially is for Kat, and that is, given the changes, all the sort of chaos that you set out, Kat, about the way, all the different things that happened at the beginning of this bill with the ministers changing and so on and instructions, Is there any scope for appealing to the Speaker, for instance, the Speaker in the Commons, or indeed perhaps the Speaker in the Lords, about trying to ensure that more time was allocated to this bill? And did anyone attempt to do that?
There's no point. It's perfectly all right for a government to change a bill through different departments and change the ministers that are sitting on a bill committee. It stinks, but it's perfectly allowed within the rules, if you will. So no, there's nothing we can do about it. There were conversations between Labour whips and Tory whips. I'm not speaking out of turn, but there was a conversation where we asked for extra evidence sessions so that we could take evidence on electoral systems, and that was declined by the Conservative whips. So there is scope for a bill committee to extend and add sessions, but it needs to be consensual across the two main parties. And whilst we wanted extra sessions, the Conservatives, you'll be surprised to know, we're not keen.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether anyone else wanted to come in on that. Just to say that we do know from conversations with peers that they are exercised by the fact that, for instance, the instruction was issued at the last minute, so to speak. So there are aspects of the bill that I think the peers and indeed potentially the chaos around appointments of ministers, changes of ministers, that they may well want to take into account, as I believe they will in relation to the Electoral Commission, the independence of the Electoral Commission, because they have some ex-commissioners in the House of Lords who understand the Electoral Commission quite well. I'm afraid we have come to the end of our hour, and I'm afraid we didn't manage to get through all of the questions. I'm just wondering if any of our panelists would like to say a last sentence or two before we conclude. Kat, would you like to just conclude proceedings?
It's just, I mean, everyone can do something, and MPs do feel pressure from the constituents. So I have had lots of emails, and I'm really pleased. I've had lots of emails from my constituents saying, please speak out against this bill. So I'm going absolutely hell for leather on. Please email your MPs about this. It makes it so much easier, especially even if you've got a Labour MP and they will be opposing this bill, please lobby them, because it's easier for me then to persuade them to actually speak in the chamber at the report stage and take part. So no matter who your MP is, what party they are, please contact them and lobby them on this. And then I guess it's if you know anyone in the House of Lords, say hello to them.
Thank you very much, Kat. Kunle, Matteo, or Jess, would you like to make any concluding remarks?
Yeah, just knowledge is power. So our role at Voice for Change will be to spread information to the communities that we represent and make sure that people are fully informed about what's going on. My only final point would be something that I haven't touched on, but I also think needs to be looked at in more detail, is the disqualification of offenders element from holding public office, which also forms part of this bill, i.e. that if you've committed an offence, you can be excluded for up to 5 years. And that's something I'm only just beginning to familiarise myself on, but it also touches on the Communications Act. So it's not just about people who have committed serious offences like physical assault, but if you say something offensive that's deemed offensive, you can be disqualified from office for 5 years. So that's another element we need to keep an eye on.
Thank you, Kunle. That was certainly not something I was aware of. So thank you for raising that. Matteo and Jess, any last comments from you before we conclude?
Yeah, I just wanted to, first of all, echo what Kunle said around educational knowledge is power. And obviously from us, we're going to be pushing for political literacy to be a thing in schools, and we're pushing more educational resources updated with what's potentially to come from this bill. And also just to say as well, like Kat said, obviously lobby your local MP, lobby the people in power, because at the end of the day, the more we scream and shout, the more power you give those MPs to then fight our cause. And I think to mirror that, engage with the charities and civil society organizations that are in this space, because there's a lot of us, and we can all scream louder if we work together. And obviously we're going to be working with Unlock Democracy on a project coming up soon, around this and kind of raising awareness from kind of our end in regards to young people. But one of the things we also did quite successfully, I'd say, in the general election for 2019 was we worked with influencers and people that aren't normally in this space, because you can often get a message across and a lot clearer if it comes from someone that isn't directly involved in politics, because the industry can sometimes be marred with a lot of negativity. So in 2019, for example, we worked with a rapper called Drill Minister to create a track around registering to vote. And I think if we can all within the sector collaborate more with people from outside it, we can cut through the noise a little bit better, and something that we at Shout Out UK are going to be pushing more for in the coming months.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Jess.
I'll just be very brief and echo that. Just take an action, any action. We as a coalition of organisations working on this bill are fighting as hard as we can. Kat's fighting as hard as she can, and you can help us by, I noticed Grace there put something in the chat there, an Unlock Democracy action. We're all doing stuff, and there's lots of different ways for you to do things, big or small, but we always appreciate your help with these things. So please do join us in the fight.
Great. Well, thank you all. So thank you again to our panelists, Kunle, Matteo, and Jess and Kat in particular for joining us this evening. Thank you to all of those who asked questions. I apologise to those whose questions went unanswered. As Jess has just highlighted, Unlock Democracy, we have something called the Elections Bill Action Centre, which you can find on our website, which gives people an option of 6 different things they can do in relation to this bill. I checked earlier today and they're all up to date, so please do go and help yourself, so to speak. And really just finally to say thank you to Sean and Grace in particular for making sure the event runs smoothly this evening. So we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you very much, and good night.